Perfect. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. It's not very often that I get to talk just about pollinators because I do a lot of horticultural work, as Annika just outlined here, but I'm so passionate about pollinators because they are so very important for food crop production, including right here in Whatcom County, because we have several pollinator-dependent crops, such as blueberry and red raspberries, that depend on pollination services to get the fruit that we love so much. So the title of my presentation is What's Buzzing? Supporting Native Pollinators on Your Property. So I'm going to be focusing on native pollinators or wild bees, but I'll also talk a little bit about honeybees as well and differentiate the two for us this afternoon. But first, I think it's important to talk about what pollination is so that we're all on the same page. So pollination is just simply the movement of pollen, and pollen basically carries the sperm of the plant. It is essential for reproduction and to get fruit development that we, again, love to eat those fruits. So let's look at this diagram here. We have one flower here, it's a rose, and the anther is the structure that produces the pollen, again, the male portion of a plant. And what we have here is this bee who is providing pollination services. So what she's doing is she's gathering pollen, she is packing it on her pollen basket, her legs there, it's also on her head, and then as she's gathering it to feed herself and her young, she's going to be moving from other flowers and accidentally transferring that pollen to the female part of this flower. And when she does that, that transfer allows that pollen to germinate, to grow, and then to fertilize and lead to seed and fruit development. So I talked about a bee in that previous slide. So there are a lot of ways plants can achieve pollination. I'm from Iowa, so most of the plants that I grew up with, like corn, were wind or gravity pollination. So not that interesting, just personally from my end. So the animal pollinators are way more interesting. In fact, if you see here, we've got so many different animals that can participate in pollination. You see here, we've got bats, we got moths and slugs. We even have birds. Hummingbirds can contribute to pollination in blueberry, as a matter of fact. But the most important pollinators when we think about global pollination services and food production are the insects, specifically bees. So I'm an academic and I'm going to try to keep this not too academic and have too many figures in here, but I thought this figure that we're seeing here on the left from a colleague of mine was really useful to construct an idea of how important bees are for pollination services. So let me unpack this figure a little bit more. This is called a flower pollinator network. So on the left, you can't read it, but we have different species of plants. And then on the right, we have different insect groups that are pollinating those flowers. And in yellow here are the most predominant pollinators. In fact, this large bar here are the bees. And so this is just again to highlight how critically important bees are for providing pollination. So what are bees exactly and how are they different from other insects that can be providing pollination services? Well, for one, they have these pollen-bearing structures, like this beautiful yellow-faced bumblebee. She's got her corbiculae here, or pollen baskets, where she packs her pollen and then takes it back to her colony to help feed the colony and the young in that colony. They also are hairy, and that hair also picks up pollen that helps transfer the pollen from flower to flower. They're also vegetarians, so that distinguishes them from wasps, which I think all insects are pretty cool, but wasps, especially in the late summer when they're going after my barbecue, like my meat, I really don't care for that, but the bees aren't going to be doing that. Bees are vegetarians, so they're eating pollen for the protein and the fats, and then the nectar for the carbohydrates. So they're vegetarians. They're also incredibly diverse. It's estimated that here in North America, we have about 4,000 species of native bees that contribute to pollination. They're also quite docile, to distinguish them from, say, wasps as a good example. Those can be a bit aggressive sometimes. And then they're essential for life on Earth. Bees provide about 90% of the pollination services, and 1/3 of the food that we eat is pollinated by insects. And a lot of that food are some of the most nutritious foods as well, like a lot of the vegetables like tomato, or the berries like the blueberries and the raspberries and cherries and other types of tree fruits. There's also tremendous amount of diversity in bees, and digging into this field has been perhaps the most illuminating for me. Is just the diversity of bees in the world. And this is just a sample. So if you have little ones, like I have my daughter here today, it's so fun to go online and watch videos about bee diversity. There's a lot of great resources out there that are educational and just beautiful. So here at the center, we have our European honeybee. European honeybees are essential too for commercial crop pollination purposes, and a lot of us love to eat their honey, but they aren't native. They are originally from the Old World. But some of these other bees are natives, and we have them here in Whatcom County, like this little tiny sweat bee, the Lagioglossum, or mason bees like Osmia. We have leafcutter bees in parts of eastern Washington as well, mining bees like the Andrena, and then we also have green sweat bees. So learn about them if you're interested. They have some fascinating ecologies, and they are also just breathtakingly beautiful. So now I want to take a minute and differentiate honeybees from native bees, because I think this will also help you understand how best we can try to support native bees. So honeybees, incredibly important for pollination services. A lot of the growers that I work with depend on honeybees for crop pollination, and a lot of that is due to the fact that native populations just aren't plentiful enough to provide the pollination services that we need. But honeybees, they are eusocial or social. They live in colonies, and they're perennial by nature, meaning that the colony will overwinter year after year. And sometimes we do see loss, and that's a problem for beekeepers. But they are perennial, and that will distinguish them from native bees, as I'll talk about in a moment. They're generalists, so they pollinate a lot of different plants. That's why they're so useful in agricultural systems. They also have a barbed stinger. Has anyone been stung before? Show of hands, a few of us. I've been stung a lot. I think I see Brad here. I know Brad has gotten stung several times too. I would wager he's into beekeeping. But they have a barbed stinger, so it hurts when you remove it. It stays in your skin, and they have that venom packet that injects the venom in your skin as well. They make honey. How many of us like to eat honey? I love honey. It's fantastic. And they also fly over long distances, up to 3 miles, which is, again, pretty important if we're thinking about pollinating large blocks of fields. Now let's focus on the native bees. So native bees are mostly solitary, like the mason bees or the ground nesting Andrena. So it's a single individual. They're not living with a big family or anything like that. And then some of them have small colonies like this bumblebee. They're short-lived, or they have short cycles. For bumblebees, as an example, it's just that queen that overwinters. Her whole colony doesn't overwinter with her. They're specialized. Some species of bees only pollinate a single other flower type, so a lot more specialized compared to the honeybee. Most of them are stingless or have a very small stinger. And then they also do not make honey, and they fly over shorter distances. In fact, the smaller the bee, the shorter the distance that they fly. Now, a lot of us have probably heard about the problem bees are facing. And if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend this book by Dr. David Golson. It talks about the insect apocalypse, so it focuses on pollinators as well as other essential insects that are important for ecosystem services. So really great book that can illuminate how important insects are to our life. So why are these pollinators in trouble? Well, there's nuance. When it comes to honeybees, overall, their populations are not in decline. In fact, if you look at global honeybee numbers, their populations are increasing because more and more beekeepers are keeping more and more colonies. The challenge that beekeepers are having is overwintering problems and disease, and that's a big challenge for honeybees. But native bee populations, they are in serious decline globally. So why are bees in trouble? Well, I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more depth, but we have invasive species, we have land use intensification, parasites and diseases, climate change, pesticides, and then these factors all can interact to have a negative effect on native bees. So first up is invasive species. So this here is garlic mustard. That's an invasive species that maybe some of you have seen. I certainly have seen it in a number of places. So these invasive species change plant communities, and that can have a beneficial effect for generalist bees, it can have a neutral effect, but for the specialists it can have negative effects, particularly if it's displacing their primary food source. And that in turn will disrupt their pollinator relationships and can lead to the declines in their populations. When it comes to land use intensification, when we intensify and increase the scale of agriculture, oftentimes that comes at the loss of native bee habitat. So these are two figures from research out of my own program. What we're looking at here is two figures. On the y-axis is wild bee abundance on both of these figures. And on the left, our x-axis, is the proportion of semi-natural habitat that's useful for wild bees around a blueberry farm. So the key thing to note is as we have more semi-natural habitat around the field, we see greater wild bee abundance. Now let's contrast that with this figure here. We have the proportion of blueberry or cultivated blueberry around a field and wild bee abundance. And the trend is that there's a decline. And again, that's due to the fact that we don't have habitat for those wild bees. Parasites and diseases. So parasites and diseases can weaken the immune system and the health of bees. And this can lead to reduced reproduction and reduced population sizes. There's also this phenomenon called pathogen spillover. What this is domestic bees or other bees can introduce pathogens primarily on flowers when they're feeding, and that can lead to floral transmission. And unfortunately, we have a number of cases where bumblebees brought in for greenhouse pollination have escaped. They've inadvertently transferred virus or other illnesses to flowers, and that's had negative effects on wild pollinator populations. And some of you might know the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. It's in decline, although we're starting to see a few more of them here in Whatcom County. But some of its declines in populations was partially attributed to the introduction of this fungal pathogen from domestic bumblebees. And then climate change. So what happens with climate change is we have plants blooming at different times than what they're used to, and that can affect wild pollinators very negatively if they're emerging in a time where they don't have that overlap in bloom time and their activity. So essentially, if they emerge too early before their host species is blooming, then they have that loss of food source. There's also literature that documents that there's nutritional changes in pollen and nectar with climate change, mostly on the negative side. And then pesticides. So pesticides are a really big topic. So all pesticides are of concern, including some of the fungicides that we traditionally or originally thought weren't that problematic compared to insecticides. And that's in part because pesticides can have lethal and sublethal effects and sometimes synergistic effects that are really hard to study. But overall, what we're learning as a community of scientists is that pesticides can impair the ability of bees to orient, their subsequent ability to forage for pollen and nectar. It can increase their susceptibility to certain pests and diseases. It can weaken their immune system, particularly some of the fungicides we're learning can affect their microbiome, and that can lead to their reduced ability to survive and fight diseases. They have impaired memory and learning that affects their ability to find flowers or find their homes, and then this all can lead to decreased reproduction and populations. So that's a lot of doom and really sad things when you think about the plight of pollinators, but it's actually really simple to help pollinators, and we all can have a role in helping pollinators. And a lot of that is to create habitat, and we really emphasize using native species because the native species are what our native pollinators have adapted to pollinate. In fact, some of the beautiful ornamentals that we like that are not native, some of those have been bred for showy flowers, and that can come at the loss of nectar and pollen, unfortunately. If you are managing a farm, try to adopt integrated pest management, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. You also have the opportunity to engage in citizen science and talk about how important pollinators are and how you on your own farm or in your own homestead are helping pollinators. And then the other thing too to bear in mind, honeybees are great, but beekeeping of honeybees is not necessarily helping wild pollinators. In fact, there's some literature out there to support that honeybees can actually outcompete native bees for pollen and food resources. So real quick, because I know I only have a few minutes according to my watch, is that there are a few things that your habitats can do to help wild bees. They should provide food, shelter, and they should be safe. So food, again, we're talking about flower resources. Native species are best, and diversity and complexity is best, so that they have a buffet of different food options to meet their nutritional needs. They also should have continuous bloom from early spring all the way through fall, so that there's enough food over the bloom period or over their life cycle. So willow is a great species for early spring, and then goldenrod is a nice one to round up the season. And if you're interested, in the back table there's native plants for pollinators from my colleague at Oregon State University, where you can see some of the native pollinators that work well here west of the Cascade. And then host plants simply means that a lot of these plants are food, but they also can provide habitat or nesting structure for certain species. So on that same topic is shelter. So shelter is their nesting habitat, and it's really cool. Not all bees live in colonies, so remember that, and a lot of them are ground nesting, like these ground nesting andrena, or they make cavities like this bee here. And you can even provide cavities on your own for certain species like mason bees as well. Oh, and I also want to mention, when it comes to conservation, we really emphasize minimizing soil disturbances, because those ground nesting bees, their colonies or their homes can be affected by tillage or practices such as that. And then final note is that to make sure that that habitat is safe. So aim for no insecticides if you can. Those are the most lethal. And then use an integrated pest management where you're using a combination of cultural techniques, physical, mechanical techniques, maybe even biological techniques, and your last resort is chemical methodologies. These are just a few examples of good habitat as well. So on the top here we have what we call hedgerows. They're typically woody and linear elements that can surround the edge of a farm field. These are great when you have a lot of diverse native species. They also provide corridors that allow populations to move, so they don't have what we call like a genetic bottleneck. Then you also have herbaceous insectary strips. Those are great, again, mostly herbaceous wild species. Just maintaining natural habitat is great too. So this is an image of a blueberry field we do a lot of work in for research up here in Whatcom County. And this habitat here provides a plethora of wild pollinators that pollinate those blueberries. And then home gardens. There's more and more scientific literature showing that home gardeners provide a lot of benefit to wild bees just through having diverse floral resources. So integration helps crop pollination. So this is perhaps one of my favorite concepts that I think about when I message about how to help pollination on your farm and in your field, that you have an integration of practices such as good horticultural practices, pesticide stewardship, and habitat enhancements, which we've been talking about a lot this afternoon. And then you have an integration of pollinators. So you have your wild bees, potentially some alternative managed bees like mason bees, and then managed honeybees, because again, they also can provide some really critical pollination services in commercial ag systems. So there is help available too. So if you feel empowered and want to do more to help wild pollinators, I would suggest reaching out to the Whatcom Conservation District. They have conservation easement programs. The USDA also has some really great programs. My dad in Iowa, in fact, is a member of this particular program, so it was great to see some of his agricultural land get converted to help pollinators. And then there's Pollinator Partnership. We just saw one of their beautiful posters, and the Xerxes Society. They have certificate programs and a lot of great educational resources. Native plant societies, and of course, WCU research and extension programs. We are here to help as well. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening to me. I know it's kind of the lunch hour, but if you have questions, here's my email, and I'm happy to take time today as well. And then this QR code provides a link to various resources that provide information about how you can help pollinators, including wild pollinators. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Oh, and maybe in a year for spring is what that whole presentation. I can't wait for the flowers to be coming out. Thank you so much, and I will add on to what she's saying about Whatcom Conservation District. We're also here right outside this booth. You take a right, first week you find, we'll have information on our native plant sale that's coming up in 2 weeks. You can get all those amazing native plants to help pollinate your habitat on your farm, your farmstead, your backyard. And also talk to them about programs that we offer that help plant those native plants for you in certain situations, especially if you have a stream, a wetland, a ditch on your property. There are programs out there that help develop those riparian corridors for pollinators, for salmon, for all of us to benefit from, because they also have water quality benefits associated with that, those native plantings. So just putting that plug out there. And now I'd love to entertain any questions that we have for Lisa after that lovely presentation.
Can we see the pyramid again of the non-insecticide options?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to flip back at the request here. And I'm happy to share these slides as well if anyone would like them. But yep, here's the pyramid of, and this is from Beneficial Insectary. Thought it was a good example just to highlight, you know, the philosophy and how you can try to reduce the need to apply chemical pesticides.
And all of these talks are being recorded, and the PDFs are going to be available online. So you don't have to. I saw you're like, take pictures. We got you. Just check back in with the Whatcom Conservation District. If you're on our e-news, you'll be triggered as when we will be posting all of these things.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. More questions here.
Do you have any sources for wild bee pollinator houses or structures?
Yeah, so the question was if I have any sources for wild bee houses or wild bee houses. So you can buy them commercially. I don't want to say any specific names because at WC we want to be unbiased, but I would just Google like Mason bee hotels. Those are one great one that you can find. I see a lot of them at garden supply stores as well. And sometimes just, again, planting and having a nice continuous range of bloom across the season, that will bring in bees, and a lot of those ground nesters will find places to live nearby or even within your own home garden as well.
Yeah, we have that bloom chart at the Whatcom Conservation District booth as well that can really show you which native plants that you can decide to plant on your property to have a longer span of bloom time. So that would be really helpful. So
What about water when it's really hot? We've had some really hot summers.
Oh, that was a great question. So the question was about water. Yes, providing clean water is important for pollinators. So, you know, you can put out small, shallow bowls with like a straw or a stick so that if any bees land in that bowl, if they don't drown, they can crawl out. Ponds as well, they will drink from ponds if you have those on your landscape as well. Yeah.
and thinking about the establishment of those plants in our current summer conditions, as we're seeing we're getting those late summer droughts, and we do have at the Whatcom Conservation District, when we look at the bloom times, it also really shows which are most drought tolerant species, and that can be really helpful in choosing the species that will work well for you if you don't have irrigation ability. That was great.